Have you ever wondered why your compassion feels both like a blessing and a curse? Why you carry everyone's pain but feel invisible in your own? Tonight, we uncover Jung's final message. The empath is not a saint, but the silenced child who was never allowed to be selfish. And if you dare to look within, you will see that child is still alive inside you. Deep within every soul lies a secret chamber, a place where forgotten truths are buried beneath layers of silence. Among these truths is one so unsettling, so revealing, that most dare not speak it aloud. The empath, that gentle healer of wounds, is not simply a gift of nature, but the echo of a child who once learned to survive by abandoning themselves. From the very beginning of life, the child arrives as pure essence, full of instinct, longing, and unashamed need. A baby does not question whether it is right to cry, whether it is acceptable to reach for love, or whether it is selfish to demand attention. In the earliest years, there is only raw expression, the voice of the soul calling out for connection. But in some homes, this natural cry is not welcomed. The child's hunger for recognition is seen as weakness. Their tears are met not with comfort, but with disapproval. Their laughter, too loud. Their desires, too much. Slowly, a new lesson is carved into their psyche. To survive, they must silence themselves. This is where the empath begins. Not in a divine spark that makes them holier than others, but in an unspoken bargain with life itself. The bargain says, if I erase my needs, if I make myself small, if I tend to the wounds of those around me, perhaps then I will be safe, perhaps then I will be loved. The empath's sensitivity is not simply a gift, it is a shield, a survival strategy born from an atmosphere where authenticity was dangerous. Imagine a child who watches their parent collapse under the weight of unhealed trauma. The parent cannot hold space for the child's emotions because their own shadows consume them. The child senses this unspoken truth. Without words, they learn, if I express myself, I will burden them. If I demand, I will break them. So instead, they suppress their inner fire. They place the parent's needs above their own. They become the emotional guardian, the silent caretaker, the invisible one who feels too much, too soon. Carl Jung often spoke of how the psyche adapts to survive, even if it means splitting itself apart. For the empath, this adaptation is extreme. Their natural instincts for self-assertion are exiled to the unconscious. What remains in the conscious personality is attunement, compassion, and vigilance. They become experts at reading the subtle shifts in others, the flicker in an eye, the trembling in a voice, the silence that carries unspoken rage. The child turns into a mirror, reflecting what is needed and erasing what is unwanted. Yet, within this adaptation lies a tragic paradox. The very qualities that make the empath cherished, their kindness, their ability to heal, their deep intuition, were not born from freedom, but from restriction. Their gift was forged in fire. Their sensitivity is the scar of an old wound. They did not choose to become healers. They were forced to abandon their own needs so completely that they could only live by tending to the needs of others. Think about it. When a child is not allowed to be selfish, they begin to equate love with self-denial. They internalize the message, I am lovable only when I am useful. And so every act of kindness carries an invisible weight. Every offering of comfort has a silent question beneath it. Will you love me now? Even as adults, the empath may not recognize this hidden transaction. On the surface, they appear generous and selfless, but deep inside, their giving is also a cry for recognition. A cry that was silenced long ago. The empath's origin is, therefore, a story of survival through repression. A story where the natural child, wild and demanding, is exiled, while a false self, gentle, patient, endlessly giving, steps into the light. But Jung would remind us that the unconscious never forgets. The repressed child continues to live in the shadows, yearning to be acknowledged. And until that child is seen, the empath remains bound to a cycle of giving without end, healing others while silently bleeding within. This is why so many empaths feel exhausted, unfulfilled, and invisible, despite their constant efforts to bring light to others. Their exhaustion is not from compassion itself, but from the absence of reciprocity. They pour themselves into everyone around them, because long ago, they learned they were not allowed to pour into themselves. They become the listener, the comforter, the one others lean on, but when their own soul cries out, it echoes into emptiness. The empath's story is not simply one of kindness. It is the story of a wound that shaped an identity. To understand the empath, we must return to that silent moment in childhood where they first swallowed their own tears, where they first silenced their own voice, where they first realized that love was conditional. In that moment, the origin of the empath was sealed, not as a divine gift freely chosen, but as the price of survival in a world that could not hold their wholeness. Beneath the polished surface of the empath lies a paradox that few ever dare to confront. Outwardly, they appear as the embodiment of selflessness, gentle, generous, endlessly available to those in need. But in the hidden chambers of the psyche, something else stirs, something forbidden, something that was exiled in childhood yet never truly died. It is the shadow of selfishness, and for the empath, it haunts every act of giving, every sacrifice, every quiet smile that conceals an unspoken hunger. When a child learns early that their own needs are too heavy, too disruptive, or too shameful, those needs do not vanish. They descend into the unconscious, becoming part of what Jung called the shadow, the collection of all the parts of ourselves that we repress because they feel unacceptable. For the empath, selfishness, wanting, demanding, insisting, is banished into this shadow realm, and yet repression never erases. It only transforms. What is denied in daylight becomes a ghost in the dark. The empath's outward compassion is therefore not pure light. It carries the imprint of what has been lost. Every time they reach out to heal another, a silent voice within whispers, "And what about me? When will it be my turn?" They may not allow themselves to hear it. They may drown it in service, in kindness, in being everything to everyone. But the shadow does not rest. It waits. Selfishness in its truest form is not cruelty. It is not the absence of care. It is the soul's natural insistence on being recognized, on being allowed to exist for itself. It is the child pounding its fists, crying, "I want, I need," the primal declaration of selfhood. But when this is denied, when it is shamed or silenced, the child internalizes a belief that to want is dangerous, to need is wrong, to take up space is a sin. The empath then grows into adulthood with a distorted relationship to selfishness. They see it only in extremes. They see it in narcissists who trample others, in the arrogant who demand endlessly, in the ruthless who consume without remorse. And so, they vow never to become that. They overcorrect. They swing to the far end of the spectrum, living lives where their own needs are almost invisible. But the shadow cannot be denied forever. It leaks through in moments of quiet resentment, in exhaustion that borders on despair, in sudden anger that shocks even themselves. The empath who gives endlessly often finds themselves secretly longing for someone, anyone, to notice them, to put them first, to rescue them from the prison of selflessness. They may feel guilt for these desires, labeling them selfish, unworthy, wrong. But these are not the marks of greed. They are the natural cries of a soul that has been denied too long. Jung would remind us that wholeness does not come from clinging only to the light. Wholeness requires integrating the shadow. For the empath, this means turning towards selfishness not as a monster, but as a messenger. The shadow of selfishness is the guardian of their autonomy, the keeper of their unlived desires, the forgotten twin of their compassion. To ignore it is to live only half a life spent in service to others but barren of true fulfillment. Consider how often empaths describe themselves as feeling invisible. They give, they nurture, they listen, but beneath it all, they ache with the sense that no one truly sees them. This invisibility is not accidental. It is the natural result of repressing selfishness. For when you do not allow yourself to declare, "I exist, I want, I need," you fade into the background of your own story. You become a supporting character in the lives of others, rather than the protagonist of your own. The shadow of selfishness, then, is not the enemy. It is the key to reclaiming the self. It demands to be heard, but the empath often fears that if they listen, they will become monstrous, unloving, cruel. They imagine that if they allow even a drop of selfishness, it will flood the world with destruction. But in truth, selfishness, when acknowledged, is not a flood but a balance. It teaches the empath that love without boundaries is not love at all. It is sacrifice. And sacrifice without recognition is nothing more than self-erasure. The empath lives in a constant inner tension between the image they project and the shadow they repress. On the surface, they are saints. In the shadow, they are the silenced child who never got to scream. To live in harmony, they must confront this shadow, not banish it further. They must look into the mirror of their own selfishness and see not sin, but humanity. For within this forbidden word lies the seed of freedom, the lost fire of individuality, the ability to say, "I, too, deserve to exist." Every empath carries within them a wound that is older than memory, older than language, older even than their own story. It is not simply a personal wound, but an archetypal one, a wound that belongs to the collective psyche of humanity. In Jungian psychology, archetypes are universal patterns, ancient images that shape how we live and experience life. And among these archetypes, one emerges again and again in the lives of empaths: the wounded child. The wounded child is the figure of innocence betrayed. It is the image of the small one who enters the world open, trusting, radiant, only to discover that love comes with conditions. In the myth of the empath, this child is not allowed to be fully themselves. Their natural impulses, crying out when hurt, raging when denied, demanding when hungry for love, are met with rejection. Instead of unconditional acceptance, they receive a subtle but devastating message: your needs are too much, your emotions are too loud, your presence is too heavy. And so, the child learns to amputate parts of their soul in order to survive. This archetypal wound is not merely about what happened in one family. It is about the deep betrayal of innocence itself. The empath becomes the guardian of others because they were never granted a guardian of their own. They become the healer because their own wounds were never acknowledged. They become the listener because their own voice was never heard. Their compassion, so often celebrated, is the scar tissue that grew over an injury too painful to face directly. Carl Jung believed that the archetypal wound holds the key to transformation, for within the wound lies the seed of destiny. The empath's wound is no different. It shapes their entire identity, drawing them toward suffering, toward brokenness, toward the role of the caretaker. They are magnetized to pain because their unconscious still seeks the healing they never received. Every time they hold another's sorrow, a part of them longs, silently, for someone to hold theirs. Every time they rescue, they are secretly yearning to be rescued. This dynamic is not a weakness, but a pattern as old as myth itself. In countless stories across cultures, the healer is also the wounded one. The shaman becomes powerful only after being broken by illness. The hero receives their gift only after descending into the underworld. The empath, too, embodies this mythic truth. Their wound is the source of their sensitivity, their perception, their depth. But without awareness, the wound also traps them in a cycle of endless giving, endless caretaking, endless suffering. The archetypal wound of the empath is not only about emotional neglect, it is about the denial of sovereignty. The child who was never allowed to be selfish was robbed of the right to exist as a full being. They were forced into the role of the selfless one, the accommodating one, the child who smooths over conflict and carries the burdens of the family. This role became their identity. But behind the mask of the healer still lives the abandoned child, waiting to be acknowledged. Jung would describe this wound as a split in the psyche. On one side lies the persona, the socially acceptable mask of kindness, patience, and endless giving. On the other side lies the shadow, the child's rage, hunger, and longing, exiled into darkness. The empath survives by clinging to the persona, but the archetypal wound ensures that the shadow continues to pull at them. It whispers in their dreams, it surfaces in their fatigue. It erupts in moments of sudden resentment or despair. The archetypal wound never sleeps, it demands integration. And yet, the empath often resists. They fear that if they face their wound directly, they will be overwhelmed. They fear that acknowledging their rage will make them cruel, that embracing their needs will make them selfish, that reclaiming their voice will make them unlovable. These fears are the chains that keep the archetypal wound alive. The very act of denying it keeps them bound to it. The wounded child archetype is not merely an image of suffering. It is also an image of potential. It shows us that what was broken can become the source of wholeness. But for the empath, the first step is to recognize that their wound is not a personal flaw, not a weakness, not something to be ashamed of. It is an archetypal inheritance, a pattern written deep into the human soul. And as long as it remains hidden, it controls them. As long as it remains unspoken, it dictates their relationships, their choices, their sense of worth. To walk into the archetypal wound is to step into the underworld of the self. It is to face the small child who was silenced, to feel their unmet longing, their rage, their grief. It is to sit in the darkness of that room, where love was conditional, where needs were dangerous, where the soul first fractured. It is here, in this forgotten chamber of the psyche, that the empath's story truly begins. The empath spends much of their life looking outward, pouring themselves into the wounds of others, searching for meaning in selfless acts of healing. But Jung would remind us that wholeness is never found by escaping into the world of others. It can only be discovered by descending into the forgotten corridors of the self. For the empath, the path to wholeness begins with the act they were never permitted to perform, turning inward. Reclaiming the forbidden right to be selfish. To walk this path is not to abandon compassion, but to balance it with self-recognition. The empath has been conditioned to believe that selfishness is sin, that to take space is to rob someone else of it, that to say no is to betray love itself. But in truth, the very opposite is real. Without boundaries, there can be no genuine love. Without selfhood, giving becomes sacrifice, and sacrifice becomes silent despair. The empath's journey is to unlearn this distortion and to step into a new way of being, where their needs are not enemies but guides. Imagine for a moment the empath standing before a mirror. For years they have seen only the mask, the gentle smile, the calm eyes, the image of someone who gives without end. But behind the mask lies another reflection, one they have avoided all their life. In that reflection lives the child who once screamed, who once wanted, who once reached for love and was told they were too much. This child has been waiting in silence. To walk the path to wholeness is to meet this reflection without turning away, to embrace the child and whisper, "You are allowed to want. You are allowed to take. You are allowed to exist." Wholeness is not about perfection. It is about integration. The empath must take what was repressed, selfishness, desire, anger, autonomy, and weave it back into the fabric of their being. These qualities, once banished to the shadow, are not poisonous. They are vital energies that give balance and strength. To deny them is to live in half light, forever bending toward others, never standing fully upright. To reclaim them is to step into fullness, to live as a whole person rather than a fragment of one. But this path is not without resistance. The empath's entire identity has been built on selflessness. To suddenly assert boundaries feels like betrayal. To say, "I matter," feels like arrogance. To choose themselves feels like cruelty. Here lies the great tension of the empath's journey, the voice of conditioning that whispers, You are only lovable if you give everything away. The path to wholeness requires the courage to challenge this voice, to recognize it as an old echo, not a present truth. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming who you truly are, not who the world demanded you to be. For the empath, individuation means peeling away the role of the eternal caretaker and stepping into their authentic self. This does not mean abandoning empathy. It means grounding it in a foundation where their own soul is nourished first. A well that is never refilled eventually runs dry. The empath must learn that tending to their own well is not selfishness, but survival, and beyond that, it is the gateway to deeper love. The path to wholeness often reveals itself in small, radical acts. The first time the empath says no and does not justify it. The first time they express anger without drowning in guilt. The first time they choose rest over rescue. Each act awakens the forgotten child within, teaching them that they are safe now, that their existence does not depend on erasing themselves. With each step, the empath reclaims pieces of the soul that were lost in childhood. And slowly, a transformation begins. The empath, who once carried only the archetype of the wounded child, starts to embody another archetype. The sovereign self, no longer defined by sacrifice alone. They carry both compassion and power, both love and boundaries, both light and shadow. They no longer serve others to be loved. They serve because they are already whole. Their empathy ceases to be a wound and becomes instead a gift freely given, no longer a survival mechanism, but a conscious choice. This is the path Jung pointed toward, a movement away from fragmentation and toward integration. The empath must not escape their wound but enter it, not deny their shadow but embrace it, not reject their selfishness but honor it as sacred. Only then can they step beyond the old identity, beyond the endless cycle of exhaustion, into a life where giving and receiving flow in balance. The path to wholeness is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering who was hidden, who was silenced, who was exiled long ago, and welcoming them home. It is about holding both the healer and the child, both the giver and the one who takes, both the light of compassion and the dark fire of desire within the same heart. It is about realizing that selfishness and empathy are not opposites, but two halves of the same truth, and only together can they form a whole being. In the end, the empath's story is not simply one of kindness, nor of endless suffering. It is the story of a soul divided, one half glowing with compassion, the other half buried in silence. It is the story of a child who learned that love required erasure, and an adult who carries that erasure like a second skin. But Jung teaches us that what is repressed does not vanish, it waits. It waits in dreams, in shadows, in the quiet ache that no amount of giving can soothe. And so, the question that remains is not whether the empath will continue to heal others. It is whether they will turn inward and heal themselves. The final message is both simple and terrifying. The empath is not whole until they reclaim the right to be selfish, to demand, to want, to live for themselves. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, what part of you have you silenced for the sake of love? Where have you mistaken self-erasure for compassion? And what would it mean, truly mean, to give yourself permission to exist without apology? The empath's liberation does not lie in greater sacrifice. It lies in balance. It lies in embracing the wounded child and the sovereign self as one. It lies in walking the narrow path where empathy is no longer a wound, but a choice, no longer a survival mechanism, but a conscious act of love. The final truth is this: healing does not come from pouring endlessly into others. Healing comes when you dare to pour, at last, into yourself. And perhaps the deepest act of love you can ever offer the world is to finally become whole.